A quiet morning at Maple Grove Elementary takes a dark turn when Officer Michael Anderson notices something unusual during his routine patrol. A small boy, no older than 7, stands frozen at the school entrance, his Batman backpack clutched tightly against his chest. His eyes dart nervously, scanning the nearly empty parking lot as parents and children stream past him into the building. But it's not the boy's stillness that catches Mike's attention. It's the silent tears streaming down his face. Before Mike can step out of his patrol car, a woman hurries over, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Her business suit is immaculate, but her movements are jerky, almost frantic. As she reaches for the boy's hand, he flinches and whispers something that makes Mike's blood run cold. "She's not my mom. Please help me." The woman yanks the boy away, practically dragging him toward a silver SUV. Mike's instincts, honed by 12 years on the force, scream that something is terribly wrong. What begins as a routine school patrol suddenly transforms into a desperate race against time, where every second could mean the difference between saving a child and losing him forever. Before we dive into this heart-wrenching story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe in the power of trust and vigilance, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community of people who care about making a difference. Now, let's uncover the truth behind this mysterious encounter. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Officer Michael Anderson guided his patrol car through the familiar streets of Riverside, Oregon. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Grove Elementary's red brick facade, where parents and children created a bustling scene of backpacks, lunchboxes, and morning goodbyes. Mike had always enjoyed his morning patrols past the school. They reminded him of simpler times, of innocence that needed protecting. He pulled into his usual spot, a strategic position that gave him clear views of both the main entrance and the parking lot. The school's security cameras had been acting up lately, and Principal Wilson had requested increased police presence during drop-off times. Mike sipped his coffee, watching the organized chaos of another school day beginning. That's when he first noticed the boy. Standing just beside the main entrance steps, the child seemed oddly still amid the swirling activity around him. His Batman backpack, covered in colorful pins, hung limply from one shoulder. Dark hair fell across his forehead, partially hiding. Eyes that never stopped moving, scanning the crowd with an intensity that seemed wrong for someone so young. Mike set down his coffee, years of experience telling him something wasn't right. He'd seen thousands of kids arriving at school, excited ones, drowsy ones, even the occasional tantrum thrower. But this was different. This boy looked like a deer caught in headlights, frozen between flight and surrender. The officer reached for his radio, intending to call in his location, when a sharp movement caught his eye. A woman in a charcoal gray business suit emerged from behind a minivan, her high heels striking the pavement with military precision. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, not a strand out of place, but her movements were too quick, too rigid. She made a beeline for the boy, her designer handbag swinging with each determined step. Mike's hand stayed on his radio as he watched the scene unfold. The woman reached the boy, placing a manicured hand on his shoulder. To anyone else, it might have looked like a mother nudging a hesitant child towards school. But Mike saw the boy's entire body tense at her touch. "Tommy," the woman's voice carried across the parking lot, sweet but with an edge that raised the hair on Mike's neck. "We're going to be late, sweetheart. Come along now." The boy, Tommy, didn't move. His small hands gripped the straps of his backpack so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but in that moment, the morning bustle seemed to fade away, leaving his words crystal clear. "She's not my mom. Please help me." The woman's smile never wavered, but her grip on Tommy's shoulder tightened visibly. In one fluid motion, she grabbed his arm and began pulling him toward a silver Lexus SUV parked in the visitors section. "Tommy's not feeling well today," she announced loudly to no one in particular. "We're going to the doctor." Mike was already out of his car, his coffee forgotten. "Ma'am," he called out, keeping his voice steady and professional. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" The woman's head snapped toward him, her smile frozen in place. For a split second, something wild flickered in her eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by a mask of polite concern. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Just a routine check," Mike replied, moving closer while maintaining a non-threatening stance. "School policy, you understand. Could I see some ID?" The woman's hand slipped into her designer bag. Tommy's eyes followed her movement wide with fear. Just then, a group of late-arriving students rushed past, momentarily blocking Mike's view. When they cleared, the woman had Tommy's arm in a vice-like grip and was practically running toward her SUV. "Stop!" Mike shouted, breaking into a run. But the woman was faster than she looked in those heels. She yanked open the SUV's back door, shoved Tommy inside, and slammed it shut before Mike could reach them. The engine roared to life. Mike sprinted back to his patrol car, heart pounding. As he threw the car into drive, he grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Anderson. I need immediate backup at Maple Grove Elementary. Possible child abduction in progress. Silver Lexus SUV heading east on Pine Street. License plate." The rest of his words were drowned out by the screech of tires as the silver SUV careened out of the parking lot, narrowly missing a startled crossing guard. Mike followed, lights flashing, his mind racing through possible scenarios. Who was this woman? Where was she taking Tommy? And most importantly, how long had this boy been silently crying for help before someone finally noticed? As his patrol car accelerated through the morning traffic, Mike made a silent promise to the frightened child he'd glimpsed in the parking lot. He would find him. He would bring him home, whatever it took. If this story has touched your heart so far, make sure to hit that like button. Your support helps us share more stories about the everyday heroes who protect our communities. Subscribe to join our family and never miss another powerful story of courage and justice. The morning sun cast long shadows as students filed into Maple Grove Elementary, leaving behind whispers and confusion in the wake of the incident. Principal Patricia Wilson stood at the entrance, her usual composed demeanor shaken as she directed staff to gather security footage. Inside the school office, Officer Michael Anderson leaned against the wall, his radio crackling with updates from pursuing units. The silver Lexus was last spotted heading toward the interstate, dispatch reported. Units are in pursuit, but traffic is heavy. Mike ran his fingers through his hair, frustration building. Every second counted, and somewhere out there, a terrified little boy needed help. He pulled out his notebook, focusing on the details he'd gathered. The woman hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. There had to be a pattern, a history. "Dr. Wilson," he called out to the principal, who was speaking with a concerned teacher. "I need everything you have on Tommy Mitchell, class records, emergency contacts, anything unusual in the past few weeks." Patricia Wilson nodded, her heels clicking against the linoleum as she moved to her computer. "Tommy started here just 3 weeks ago," she said, pulling up his file. "Transferred from Westbrook Elementary across town. His parents, David and Jennifer Mitchell, seemed like lovely people, very involved." Mike's phone buzzed. Detective Sarah Martinez was calling. He'd worked with her on several cases involving children, and her insight was invaluable. "Anderson," he answered, stepping into the hallway. "Mike, I'm looking at the surveillance feeds from surrounding businesses." Sarah's voice was focused, determined. The Lexus passed Cooper's Market heading east, then turned north on Highland Avenue. Frank Cooper says he's seen that woman before, coming into his store with Tommy last week. Said something felt off about her. Mike's pulse quickened. Did he get a name? Rebecca Foster, paid with a credit card. We're running it now. The name tickled something in Mike's memory. He'd heard it before, somewhere in the endless stream of bulletins and reports that crossed his desk. Send me everything you find. I'm heading to talk to Tommy's parents now. The Mitchells' home sat on a quiet street in the Oak Ridge neighborhood. A modest two-story with a basketball hoop in the driveway and fall decorations dotting the front porch. As Mike pulled up, he noticed signs of a normal family life. A child's bicycle leaning against the garage, a garden hose coiled neatly by a bed of withering summer flowers. Jennifer Mitchell opened the door before he could knock, her face pale, with worry. Officer Anderson, the school called. They said something happened with Tommy. Is he okay? Mike followed her inside, where David Mitchell paced the living room, phone pressed to his ear. Family photos lined the walls. Tommy at various ages, always smiling, always surrounded by love. The contrast between those images and the frightened boy from this morning made Mike's chest tighten. Mr. Mitchell, Mike said quietly. David lowered his phone, his expression haunted.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I need you both to sit down. Tell me everything you know about Rebecca Foster. The color drained from Jennifer's face. How do you know that name? Over the next hour, a disturbing picture emerged. Rebecca Foster had been their son's teacher. At Westbrook Elementary last year, she'd taken a special interest in Tommy, volunteering to tutor him after school, bringing him small gifts. At first, the Mitchells had been grateful for her attention. Tommy struggled with reading, and Rebecca seemed dedicated to helping him improve. But then things started getting strange, David explained, his hand gripping his wife's. She'd show up at his soccer games, even though she wasn't invited. We'd see her car parked down the street. Tommy started having nightmares, but he wouldn't tell us what they were about. Jennifer wiped tears from her eyes. We transferred him to Maple Grove to get away from her. We thought we were being paranoid, but Tommy seemed so relieved when we told him he was changing schools. We should have known, should have done more. Mike's phone buzzed again, a text from Sarah. Rebecca Foster's background check had come back. 5 years ago, she'd lost her own son in a custody battle. The boy, also 7 at the time, had died in a car accident while visiting his father. Rebecca had suffered a mental breakdown, spent time in Hillside Mental Health Center, and eventually returned to teaching. But there were red flags, complaints from parents about inappropriate attachments to male students, sudden mood swings, erratic behavior. We're going to find him, Mike promised the Mitchells, his voice firm. Every officer in Riverside is looking for your son, but I need to know. Is there anywhere Rebecca might take him? Any place she mentioned? Any connection to Tommy's interests? Jennifer shook her head, but David suddenly straightened. The cabin, he said. She used to talk about her family's cabin by Crystal Lake, said she wanted to take Tommy fishing there someday, but we obviously said no. Mike was already moving, calling Sarah as he headed for his car. The lake was an hour north of the city, accessible by only one main road. If Rebecca was trying to disappear with Tommy, that's where she'd go. Back at the station, Sarah Martinez coordinated with state police to set up roadblocks. Traffic cameras had tracked the Lexus to the highway, leading north, but they'd lost it near the Crystal Lake exit. Time was running out. Frank Cooper, the market owner, provided security footage of Rebecca's previous visits with Tommy. The images were chilling. Her possessive grip on the boy's shoulder, the way she'd glare at anyone who spoke to him, how Tommy seemed to shrink into himself whenever she was near. She's been planning this, Sarah said, studying the footage. Those visits weren't random. She was conditioning him, isolating him, making him afraid to speak up. Mike stared at the images, anger building in his chest. How many times had Tommy tried to signal for help? How many adults had missed the signs, dismissed his fear as simple shyness? The boy's whispered words from this morning echoed in his mind. "She's not my mum. Please help me." The radio crackled. A state trooper had spotted the Lexus turning onto Crystal Lake Road. Mike grabbed his keys, but Sarah stopped him. "Wait," she said. "If we go in with sirens blazing, she might panic. She's unstable, delusional. We need to handle this carefully." She was right. But the thought of Tommy spending another minute with that woman made Mike's skin crawl. They gathered. A team coordinated their approach. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by dense forest. They'd need to move quickly, quietly, and above all, keep Tommy safe. As they drove north, the city gave way to rolling hills and thick woods. Autumn leaves created a canopy of red and gold above the winding road. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful, but all Mike could think about was a little boy with a Batman backpack, silently begging for someone to notice his fear. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky as they approached Crystal Lake. Sarah's voice came through the radio, calm and focused. "All units in position. Remember, this is a hostage situation involving a minor. Approach with extreme caution." Mike parked his car out of sight and made his way through the woods toward the cabin. Through the trees, he could see smoke rising from the chimney. A child's voice carried on the wind, Tommy, sounding scared and confused. "Please, Miss Foster, I want to go home." "This is your home now, sweetheart. Just like we planned, everything's going to be perfect." Mike's hand tightened on his radio. The time for waiting was over. That little boy had been brave enough to ask for help. Now it was time to answer his call. Golden light filtered through the dense forest canopy as Officer Michael Anderson crept closer to the lakeside cabin. The weathered structure stood silent against the backdrop of Crystal Lake, its windows glowing warmly despite the tension in the air. Mike moved carefully through the underbrush, his boots making no sound on the carpet of fallen leaves. Detective Sarah Martinez's voice whispered through his earpiece, barely audible above the gentle lapping of lake water against the shore. "Team 2 in position on the north side. No movement visible through the kitchen window." Inside the cabin, Tommy Mitchell's voice drifted through a partially open window, trembling but clear. "Miss Foster, why are there men in the woods?" Mike froze, his heart pounding. Rebecca Foster's response came sharp and quick, her earlier sweetness evaporating. "Get away from the window, Tommy, now." The sound of rapid footsteps echoed from inside, followed by the harsh scrape of furniture being moved. Mike pressed his back against a large oak tree, signaling to the nearest officers. They needed to move fast but carefully. One wrong move could turn this situation deadly. The cabin's interior light shifted as Rebecca moved through the rooms. Her shadow danced across the windows, erratic and unpredictable. "Nobody's going to take you away from me," she was saying, her voice rising with each word. "I won't let them hurt you like they hurt my Charlie. Not again. Never again." Sarah's voice crackled in Mike's ear again. "All units hold position. Wait for my signal." But Mike's attention was fixed on a small figure visible through the window. Tommy stood in what appeared to be the cabin's main room, his Batman backpack still clutched to his chest like a shield. His eyes were wide, tracking Rebecca's movements as she paced the room. The boy's gaze drifted toward the window, and for a brief moment he locked eyes with Mike. Recognition flickered across Tommy's face. His lips moved silently, forming words Mike could barely make out. "Help me." Rebecca appeared behind Tommy, placing her hands on his shoulders. The boy flinched, but didn't pull away. "We're going to be so happy here," she said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "Just like I promised. No more worrying about those people who don't understand us. We can start fresh." Mike's radio crackled softly. "Frank Cooper, the market. owner, had provided more details about Rebecca's recent visits. She'd been buying camping supplies, non-perishable food, new clothes in Tommy's size. This wasn't a spontaneous kidnapping. She'd been planning it for weeks, maybe months. Through the window, Mike could see Rebecca moving toward the kitchen. She opened cupboards with sharp, jerky movements, pulling out cans and boxes. "Are you hungry, sweetheart? I'll make your favorite, macaroni and cheese, just like Charlie used to love." Tommy didn't move. "My name's not Charlie." The words hung in the air for a moment before Rebecca's hand froze mid-reach. She turned slowly, her face transforming. "What did you say?" "I'm not Charlie," Tommy repeated, his voice smaller but still clear. "I want my real mom and dad." The change in Rebecca was immediate and terrifying. Her carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing something dark and desperate underneath. She strode across the room, grabbing Tommy's arm. "Don't say that. Don't ever say that. I am your mother now. I'm the only one who really loves you, who can protect you." Mike's hand tightened on his weapon. Sarah's voice came through again, urgent now. "All units prepare to move, on my mark." But Rebecca was already pulling Tommy toward the back of the cabin. "We need to leave. They're trying to separate us, just like they separated me from Charlie. I won't let them. I won't." Tommy's voice rose in panic. "You're hurting me." That was all Mike needed to hear. He signaled to the nearest officers and moved toward the cabin's front door. Protocol demanded they wait for Sarah's order, but every instinct told him they were out of time. The door burst open under Mike's shoulder just as Rebecca was pushing Tommy toward the cabin's back exit. She spun around, pulling the boy against her like a shield. Her eyes were wild, darting between the officers now filling the small space. "Stay back!" she screamed. "He's mine! You can't take him too!" Mike held up one hand, keeping his weapon lowered. "Rebecca," he said softly, "let's talk about this. Nobody needs to get hurt here." Rebecca's grip on Tommy tightened, making the boy whimper. "You don't understand. I'm saving him. His parents don't love him like I do. They don't know how to protect him from this cruel world." "That's not true," Mike said, taking a small step forward. "Tommy's parents love him very much. They're worried sick about him, just like you worried about Charlie." The name hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her face contorted, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Don't talk about Charlie. You don't know anything about him." "I know he was 7 years old," Mike continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I know he loved macaroni and cheese. I know you miss him every single day." Rebecca's shoulders shook with silent sobs, but her grip on Tommy didn't loosen. "They took him from me. His father, the judge. They all conspired to take a baby away, and then the accident." Her voice broke. "They said it wasn't anyone's fault, but they were wrong. They were all wrong." Mike took another careful step. Behind Rebecca, he could see Sarah and her team moving into position near the back door. They just needed to keep her talking, keep her focused on Mike. "What happened to Charlie was a tragedy," Mike said. "No parent should ever have to lose a child. But Rebecca, look at Tommy. Really look at him. He's scared. He's not Charlie. And deep down, you know that." Rebecca's gaze dropped to Tommy's face, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. The boy was trembling, tears streaming down his cheeks, his small hands still clutching his Batman backpack. Charlie never liked superheroes." Rebecca whispered, her voice distant. "He loved dinosaurs." "That's right," Mike encouraged, "because Tommy isn't Charlie. He's his own person, with his own family who loves him. You're a teacher, Rebecca. You care about children. You don't want to hurt Tommy, do you?" The question seemed to pierce through Rebecca's delusion. Her grip on Tommy loosened slightly. I just wanted to feel like a mother again," she whispered. "Sometimes when I look at him, I can almost pretend." "I know," Mike said softly, "but this isn't the way. Let Tommy go. Let us help you." For a long moment, the cabin was silent, except for the sound of Rebecca's ragged breathing. Then slowly, her arms fell to her sides. Tommy immediately ran to Mike, who scooped him up as Sarah and her team moved in to secure Rebecca. As they led her away, Rebecca's composure crumbled completely. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. Charlie, Tommy, I'm sorry." Mike carried Tommy outside, where paramedics were waiting to check him over. The boy clung to him, face buried in Mike's shoulder. "You came," Tommy whispered. "You heard me." "Of course I did, buddy," Mike replied, his throat tight. "That was very brave of you asking for help this morning. You did exactly the right thing." The autumn sun was setting over Crystal Lake, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, Mike could hear sirens approaching, probably Tommy's parents, being escorted to the scene. Soon, this brave little boy would be back in their arms, safe and sound. But for now, Mike just held him, feeling Tommy's racing heart slow to a normal rhythm. Sometimes the smallest whisper could lead to the biggest changes. Sometimes all it took was one person willing to listen, to notice, to act. The fluorescent lights of Riverside Police Department buzzed overhead as Michael Anderson sat at his desk, filling out the preliminary report. Crime scene photos from the cabin were spread across his desk, Rebecca Foster's carefully arranged stockpile of supplies, Tommy's Batman backpack abandoned by the kitchen door, the elaborate escape route, mapped out in her journal. Each image told a story of meticulous planning warped by grief and delusion. Detective Sarah Martinez appeared at his desk, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She placed one in front of Mike, then settled into the chair beside him. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed the long hours they'd all put in since Tommy's rescue yesterday. "Afternoon. How's the kid doing?" she asked, shuffling through her own stack of paperwork. Mike took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth chase away some of his exhaustion. "Just got off the phone with his parents. They took him to see Dr. Emily Ross. She specializes in trauma counseling for children. Says he's shaken, but resilient. Already talking about wanting to go back to school." Sarah nodded, pulling out Rebecca's psychiatric evaluation from 6 years ago. "And Foster?" "Being held for psychiatric evaluation at Hillside. Dr. Chen's handling her case personally." Mike ran a hand through his hair, remembering the broken woman they'd led away from the cabin. Her ex-husband's flying in tomorrow, wants to understand how this happened. The precinct hummed with activity around them, but Mike's mind kept drifting back to that morning at Maple Grove Elementary. How many other children were out there, silently crying for help? How many Rebecca Fosters were hiding behind carefully constructed masks, their pain turning toxic? Grace Sullivan from Child Protective Services walked into the bullpen, her arms full of files. She'd been working overtime, investigating every child Rebecca had contact with during her teaching career. So far, Tommy was the only one she'd escalated to abduction. But there were concerning patterns. "You need to see this," Grace said, spreading the files across Mike's desk. "I've been going through her performance reviews from Westbrook Elementary, multiple instances of what they called excessive attachment to male students, particularly those around 7 or 8 years old." Sarah leaned forward, scanning the documents. Charlie's age. "Exactly," Grace confirmed, but every time concerns were raised, she'd transfer to a different school or switch grade levels. The red flags were there, but nobody connected the dots. Mike picked up one of the reports, dated just 3 months ago. A parent had complained about Rebecca showing up uninvited to their son's baseball game. The school's response had been to reassign her to a different class. No further action taken. "System failed these kids," Mike muttered. "Failed Rebecca too, in a way. After Charlie died, she should have had better support, better monitoring." A knock on the doorframe interrupted them. Principal Patricia Wilson stood there, looking both exhausted and determined. "Officer Anderson, could I have a moment?" Mike nodded, gesturing her inside. Patricia settled into an empty chair, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "We're implementing new security protocols at Maple Grove," she began. "Better surveillance, stricter pickup procedures. But I can't stop thinking about Tommy, about what we missed." "Don't blame yourself," Sarah said gently. "Rebecca was clever. She knew how to work the system." Patricia shook her head. "That's just it, though. The signs were there. Tommy's behavior changed so dramatically after she started paying attention to him at Westbrook. When the Mitchells transferred him to our school, we should have dug deeper into why." Mike remembered Tommy's small voice that morning, barely a whisper but full of desperate courage. Sometimes the quietest cries for help were the most important ones to hear. Down the hall, the interview room door opened. David and Jennifer Mitchell emerged, followed by two detectives. They'd spent hours providing detailed statements, reliving every interaction with Rebecca Foster, every warning sign they'd tried to report. Jennifer caught Mike's eye and managed a small smile. The terror of yesterday was still visible in the shadows under her eyes, but there was strength there too. She walked over to their group, David's hand steady at her back. "Tommy is asking for you," Jennifer said to Mike. "He wants to thank you himself. Would you be willing to come by the house later, when you're done here?" Mike glanced at Sarah, who nodded. "Go. We've got this covered. Sometimes the follow-up is just as important as the rescue." The Mitchells' home looked different in the late afternoon light. The fear and desperation of yesterday had been replaced by a cautious peace. Halloween decorations swayed gently in the breeze. Tommy had insisted on putting them up this morning, his parents said, wanting everything to feel normal again. Tommy was in the backyard when Mike arrived, carefully arranging action figures on the patio table. His Batman backpack, cleaned and returned by the evidence team, sat beside him like a faithful guardian. He looked up when Mike approached, and this time his smile reached his eyes. "Officer Mike!" Tommy jumped up, then hesitated, suddenly shy. Thank you for finding me, and for believing me." Mike crouched down to Tommy's level, taking in the boy's clear eyes and steady voice. "You did the hard part, buddy. You were brave enough to ask for help. That takes real courage." Tommy fidgeted with one of his action figures. "I was scared," he admitted. "Miss Foster, she used to be nice, but then she started saying weird things about how I reminded her of someone and how she could protect me better than anyone else." Mike nodded encouragingly, letting Tommy set the pace of the conversation. "She would wait for me after school sometimes, even after we changed schools. Said we had a special connection." Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper. "She said if I told anyone, bad things would happen. But then yesterday morning I saw you and I just couldn't pretend anymore." Jennifer appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray of cookies and lemonade. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears as she listened to her son speak. David stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder. "You know none of this was your fault, right?" Mike said to Tommy. "Ms. Foster was very sick and she needed help. You didn't do anything wrong." Tommy nodded slowly. "Dad says she lost her little boy and it made her very sad. Is that true?" "Yes," Mike answered carefully. "But that didn't make what she did okay. Nothing excuses hurting a child or making them feel afraid." Tommy seemed to consider this, arranging his action figures in a new pattern. "Is she going to get help now?" "Yes, she is, and you helped make that happen. Because you were brave enough to speak up, Ms. Foster can get the help she needs, and other kids will be safer too." A small smile tugged at Tommy's lips. "Like a real superhero," Mike grinned. "Exactly like that. Speaking of which..." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package. "The department has these special badges we give to especially brave kids. Would you like one?" Tommy's eyes widened as Mike pinned the junior officer badge to his shirt. The metal caught the sunlight, gleaming like a promise. Later that evening, as Mike drove home through the quiet streets of Riverside, he thought about courage and how it came in all sizes. Sometimes it roared like a lion, and sometimes it whispered like a scared little boy asking for help. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. Rebecca's initial psychiatric evaluation was complete. She'd had a complete break from reality, convinced she could replace her lost son by taking Tommy. With proper treatment, there was hope for recovery, but the road would be long. At a stoplight, Mike noticed a father and son walking along the sidewalk, the boy wearing a cape that fluttered in the evening breeze. The father held his son's hand loosely, naturally, the way Jennifer and David Mitchell would never take for granted again. The light turned green, and Mike drove on, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new children who needed someone to notice their silent pleas. But for tonight, at least, one brave little boy was safe at home. His whispered cry for help answered. A chilly autumn wind rustled through the courtyard of Hillside Mental Health Center as Dr. Marcus Chen reviewed his notes. Through the reinforced window of his office, he could see Rebecca Foster sitting in the garden, her hospital-issued clothes a stark contrast to the tailored suits she once wore. Her blonde hair, now loose and unkempt, swayed in the breeze as she stared at a child's drawing clutched in her trembling hands. The sound of footsteps drew Dr. Chen's attention to his office door. Detective Sarah Martinez stood there, manila folder tucked under her arm. Her expression was grim but professional as she entered the room. "Doctor?" She nodded in greeting. "How's our patient doing?" Dr. Chen gestured for her to take a seat, closing Rebecca's file with a quiet sigh. "The medication is helping stabilize her moods, but the underlying trauma, it's deeply rooted. She's beginning to understand what she did, and that recognition brings its own kind of crisis." Sarah placed her folder on the desk, revealing new documents about Rebecca's past. "We found something interesting in her ex-husband's statement. Apparently, before Charlie's death, there were incidents. Times when Rebecca would become fixated on other children, claiming they were sending her messages or choosing her." Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. That wasn't in her previous medical records. Robert Foster kept it quiet, said he was trying to protect her career, their reputation. After Charlie died, he blamed himself for not getting her more help earlier. Outside in the garden, Rebecca had begun arranging small stones in a pattern only she could see. Her movements were precise, methodical, just as they had been when planning Tommy's abduction. But now, those same hands shook with the weight of reality crashing back in. "She talks about Charlie constantly," Dr. Chen said, watching his patient through the window. "But there's something different now. She's starting to distinguish between her memories of him and her delusions about Tommy. This morning, she asked to write a letter to the Mitchell family." Sarah leaned forward. "Did you let her?" "Not yet. We need to be certain she understands the gravity of her actions, that any contact with Tommy or his family must be carefully managed, if it happens at all." A soft knock interrupted them. Grace Sullivan from CPS entered, carrying her own stack of files. The three of them had been meeting regularly, piecing together the complex puzzle of Rebecca's descent into obsession. "The school board completed their internal investigation," Grace announced, spreading documents across Dr. Chen's desk. "Found at least 3 other instances where Rebecca showed concerning behavior toward male students. Each time, she was transferred or given administrative leave. No formal reports filed." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Protecting the institution instead of the children. It's more complicated than that," Grace sighed. "Rebecca was an excellent teacher by all accounts. Test scores up, parent satisfaction high. The red flags were subtle unless you knew what to look for. And after Charlie's death, people were sympathetic. wanted to give her space to grieve. Dr. Chen made notes in his file, connecting new dots in Rebecca's psychological profile. Grief can mask many things. The loss of her son cracked her foundation, but the cracks were there before. Each time she became fixated on a child, she was trying to fill a void that existed long before Charlie's death. The garden door opened, and an orderly guided Rebecca back inside. Through the office window, they could see her walking down the hallway, shoulders hunched, still clutching the drawing. Her steps were hesitant, as if she wasn't quite sure where. Reality ended, and her delusions began. She's asked about Tommy, Dr. Chen revealed. Not as a replacement for Charlie anymore, but with genuine concern. Wants to know if she hurt him, if he's afraid. Sarah nodded slowly. And what do you tell her? The truth. That Tommy is safe, in therapy, surrounded by love. That her actions traumatized him, but children are remarkably resilient when given proper support. Grace gathered her files, pausing to watch Rebecca disappear around the corner. Has she talked about the other children, the ones before Tommy? Not yet, Dr. Chen replied, but as the delusions fade, more memories surface. It's like watching someone wake up from a very long dream, realizing the impact of their actions in the light of day. The three of them spent the next hour reviewing Rebecca's case, mapping out treatment plans and security protocols. Outside, the autumn sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the garden where Rebecca had left her careful arrangement of stones. Later that evening, Dr. Chen sat across from Rebecca in the quiet of his office. She'd finally let go of the drawing, a child's view of a happy family stored in her classroom desk for years after Charlie's death. Tell me about the morning at Maple Grove, Dr. Chen prompted gently. What were you thinking when you saw Officer Anderson? Rebecca's hands twisted in her lap. I wasn't thinking clearly. When Tommy whispered to him, all I could see was Charlie being taken away again. But it wasn't Charlie. It was never Charlie. Her voice broke. What have I done? You're ill, Rebecca. But acknowledging that is the first step toward healing. Tears slid down her cheeks. I remember everything now. The way Tommy trembled when I touched him. The fear in his eyes. I told myself it was just adjustment, that he'd learned to love me like Charlie did. But I was hurting him, wasn't I? Just like I probably hurt those other boys. Dr. Chen leaned forward. Do you want to talk about the other children? Rebecca nodded slowly, pain etching deep lines around her mouth. After Charlie died, I'd see him everywhere, in my classroom, on the playground. Sometimes a child would smile a certain way or laugh just like him, and I'd convince myself it was a sign that Charlie was leading me to them. She paused, struggling to organize her fractured memories. There was a boy in my class last spring, Kevin. He had Charlie's cowlick, the same way of scrunching his nose when he concentrated. I started staying late at school, volunteering to tutor him. His mother complained when I showed up at his Little League game. What happened then? The principal suggested I take some time off. When I came back, they moved me to a different grade level. I was so angry. Couldn't they see I was just trying to help? To protect these children like I failed to protect Charlie? Dr. Chen made notes, watching Rebecca's face as she confronted her past actions. And Tommy, what drew you to him? Rebecca's hands shook as she picked up the drawing again. He was reading alone at recess. The other kids were playing, but he sat under a tree with his book just like Charlie used to. Something inside me just snapped. I convinced myself he was unhappy, that he needed me, that God was giving me a second chance to be a mother. But Tommy had a mother, Dr. Chen said quietly, a family who loved him. I know that now, Rebecca whispered. When I close my eyes, I see his face in the cabin. The terror when I grabbed him. No child should ever look that way. She crumpled the drawing in her fist. "I'm a monster!" "No, Rebecca. You're someone who experienced a devastating loss and didn't get the help you needed, but you're getting it now." Rebecca smoothed the wrinkled paper, trying to erase the damage. "Will I ever be able to teach again? Let's focus on your recovery first. Small steps." As Dr. Chen walked Rebecca back to her room, they passed the garden window. The stones she'd arranged earlier caught the last light of day, forming a pattern he could now recognize, the shape of a heart, broken but trying to heal. In his final notes that evening, Dr. Chen wrote, "Patient showing increased awareness of reality versus delusion, feelings of guilt emerging as psychiatric medication takes effect. Prognosis uncertain but hopeful. Recommend continued observation and intensive therapy." Autumn leaves danced across the playground of Maple Grove Elementary as Tommy Mitchell sat on his favorite bench, a new book open in his lap. 2 weeks had passed since his ordeal, and the whispers that followed him through the hallways had finally begun to fade. His Batman backpack rested beside him, now adorned with a shiny junior police badge that caught the morning sunlight. Dr. Emily Ross observed him from her office window, making notes in his file. The child psychologist had been working with Tommy 3 times a week, helping him process his trauma through art therapy and play sessions. Today marked a significant milestone, his first full week back at school. A gentle knock on her door drew her attention. Jennifer Mitchell stood there, clutching a familiar stuffed animal, the bunny Tommy had left behind at the cabin. "He forgot. This again," she said softly, running her fingers over the worn fur. "He says he doesn't need it anymore, but—" Dr. Ross gestured for her to sit. "But you're worried about him trying to be too brave too soon." Jennifer nodded, sinking into the comfortable chair across from the desk. "He insists he's fine, but I hear him at night sometimes, talking in his sleep, and he checks the locks on his windows over and over." Through the window, they watched as another student approached Tommy's bench. For a moment, the boy tensed, but then relaxed as he recognized his friend. Soon, they were both laughing over something in the book. "That's actually a good sign," Dr. Ross explained, making another note. "Tommy's developing healthy coping mechanisms. He's cautious but not paralyzed by fear. The security routines, checking locks, staying aware of his surroundings, those are his way of taking control." Jennifer twisted the bunny's ear, a habit she'd developed during the long hours of Tommy's absence. "David thinks we should move, start fresh somewhere else. But Tommy doesn't want to leave his friends, his school. And what do you think?" "I think—" Jennifer paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think running away won't fix anything. Tommy was brave enough to face his fear and ask for help. Maybe we need to be brave too." Dr. Ross smiled approvingly. "Tommy's resilience is remarkable, but children often take their emotional cues from their parents. Your strength, your willingness to work through this as a family, that's giving him permission to heal at his own pace." The school bell rang, and they watched Tommy gather his things, giving his friend a high five before heading inside. His steps were lighter now, more confident than they'd been since his return. "There is something else," Jennifer said, her voice dropping. "Rebecca Foster's doctor reached out. She's written letters to Tommy, to us. They've been screened by her psychiatric team, but I don't know if we should let Tommy see them." Dr. Ross leaned back in her chair, considering. "What do the letters say?" "They're apologies, mostly. Explanations about her son, her illness. The doctor says writing them is part of her therapy, but she'll understand if we never read them." "And how do you feel about them?" Jennifer said. "The stuffed bunny on the desk, its button eyes staring blankly ahead. Part of me wants to burn them. She took my baby, made him fear his own shadow, but another part—" She trailed off, tears gathering in her eyes. "Another part recognizes her pain," Dr. Ross suggested gently. "Is that wrong?" to feel sympathy for someone who hurt your child. Empathy isn't a betrayal of Tommy. It's possible to understand someone's pain while still condemning their actions. The conversation was interrupted by a soft tap at the door. Tommy stood there, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Mom, are you coming to my presentation?" Jennifer quickly wiped her eyes, managing a warm smile. "Of course, sweetie. Wouldn't miss it." Tommy beamed, then noticed the stuffed bunny. "You can donate him to the hospital, Mom. Other kids might need him more than me now." Dr. Ross watched them leave, noting the way Tommy walked close to his mother, but no longer clung to her. In her file, she wrote, "Patient showing significant progress, using age-appropriate coping strategies, family dynamic strong and supportive." Udun. In the school library, Tommy's class gathered for their Community Heroes presentations. Each student had chosen someone who made a difference in their lives. Some picked firefighters, teachers, or doctors. Tommy stood at the front of the E room, his voice clear and steady as he spoke about Officer Michael Anderson. "Heroes don't always wear capes," he read from his carefully written report. "Sometimes they just listen when you're scared. Sometimes they believe you when you whisper." Principal Wilson, watching from the back of the room, felt tears prick her eyes. The school had implemented new security measures, better training for staff, but perhaps the most important change was less tangible. They'd learned to listen, really listen, to their students' unspoken fears. After school, Tommy attended his weekly support group for children who had experienced trauma. The sessions, led by Grace Sullivan from CPS, gave kids a safe space to share their feelings and learn they weren't alone. "Remember," Grace told the circle of young faces, "what happened to you doesn't define you. Your courage, your strength, your ability to keep going. That's what matters." Tommy raised his hand. "Sometimes I still get scared," he admitted. "But then I remember I'm not alone anymore. I have my mom and dad, my friends, Officer Mike, and all of you." The other children nodded in understanding. Each had their own story, their own wounds to heal, but together they were learning to trust again, to hope again. Later that evening, Tommy sat at his desk, working on a new drawing. His art had changed since the incident. Fewer shadows, more light. Today's picture showed a group of people holding hands, his family, his doctors, his friends from support group. Jennifer watched from the doorway, the bundle of Rebecca's letters heavy in her pocket. Maybe someday they would read them together when Tommy was older and stronger. For now, they would focus on healing, on rebuilding trust, on finding light in the darkness. Outside, Officer Mike Anderson drove past their house on his evening patrol. He smiled seeing Tommy's bedroom light on, knowing the boy was safe, surrounded by love. Sometimes the smallest whisper could start the biggest change. Sometimes courage wore a Batman backpack and taught the whole world how to be brave. The autumn wind carried fallen leaves down the quiet street, each one a reminder that change was natural, necessary, and sometimes beautiful. Inside his warm house, Tommy added one final detail to his drawing, a small badge shining like a star, guiding the way home. Robert Foster stood in the doorway of Hillside Mental Health Center, his polished shoes and crisp suit a stark contrast to the institutional setting. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, earned in the years since his son's death. He hadn't seen Rebecca since the divorce, hadn't wanted to face the empty shell she'd become after Charlie's accident. But Detective Sarah Martinez's call had changed everything. Inside Dr. Chen's office, Rebecca sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, a pale shadow of the confident woman she'd once been. She looked up as Robert entered, and for a moment, neither spoke. The weight of their shared loss filled the space between them. "Hello, Rebecca," Robert said softly, taking the chair across from her. Dr. Chen sat quietly at his desk, observing the interaction. Rebecca's fingers twisted together. "You didn't have to come." "Yes, I did." Robert leaned forward, studying her face. "Why didn't you tell me you were struggling again? After all these years, you could have reached out." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "And say what? That I was seeing our dead son everywhere? That I couldn't stop myself from—" Her voice cracked. "You moved on, Robert. New wife, new life. I was supposed to do the same." Dr. Chen cleared his throat gently. "Rebecca, why don't you tell Robert about the progress you've been making in therapy?" She straightened slightly, her therapist's presence seeming to ground her. "I'm starting to understand what happened, not just with Tommy, but before. The other children I fixated on, the delusions. It wasn't really about them. It was about Charlie. Always about Charlie." Robert's expression softened. "The accident wasn't your fault, Beck. I should have said that more back then. Should have fought harder to help you instead of just walking away." Tears spilled down Rebecca's cheeks. "Do you remember his last morning? He was so excited about the science fair, kept talking about his volcano project all through breakfast." "Red food coloring and baking soda?" Robert smiled sadly. He insisted on wearing his lab coat, even though it was 3 sizes too big. For a moment, they were both lost in the memory of their son's bright smile, his endless enthusiasm. Then, reality crashed back in, and Rebecca's shoulders slumped. "I see him sometimes," she whispered. "Not like before. Not in other children's faces. Just memories. The way he'd scrunch his nose when he was thinking hard. How he always saved the crusts of his sandwich for last." Dr. Chen made a note in his file. "These are healthy memories, Rebecca, different from the delusions that led to Tommy's abduction." At the mention of Tommy's name, Robert's expression hardened slightly. "The Mitchell's lawyer contacted me. They're not pressing additional charges, but they want assurance you'll never work with children again." Rebecca nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "I know. I don't trust myself anymore either. Sometimes I think about all the children I taught, wonder if I scared them without realizing it. If I was already breaking even before Charlie died." "You were a good teacher," Robert said quietly, "and a good mother. What happened? It changed us both. But you're getting help now. That's what matters." Dr. Chen watched their interaction carefully. "Robert, would you be willing to participate in some family therapy sessions? Rebecca's healing process could benefit from exploring these shared memories in a controlled environment." Robert hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'd like that, and I brought something." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a photo album. "Found this when I was cleaning out the storage unit. Thought you might want to look through it together." Rebecca's hands trembled as she touched the worn cover. Inside were photos of Charlie, birthday parties, baseball games, quiet moments. At home, real memories, not the twisted versions that had driven her to seek replacement children. "He had your smile," she said softly, tracing a picture of Charlie at the beach. "I see that now. For so long, I was looking for him in other people's children, but he was always right here." They spent the next hour looking through photos, sharing stories, grieving together in a way they never had before. Dr. Chen observed how Rebecca remained present, no longer slipping into delusions when confronted with memories of her son. Later, after Robert had left, Rebecca sat in the garden with her art therapist. Her drawings had evolved from the frantic sketches of other people's children to memorial pieces for Charlie, happy memories preserved on paper. "I want to write another letter," she told the therapist. "Not to Tommy this time, to Charlie, to say goodbye properly." In his office, Dr. Chen updated Rebecca's file. Patient showing marked improvement in distinguishing reality from delusion. Beginning to process grief in healthy ways. Family support system being rebuilt. Sarah Martinez visited later that afternoon, bringing updates about the ongoing investigation into the school system's handling of Rebecca's previous incidents. 3 administrators have resigned, she reported. New protocols are being implemented across the district. Your case is changing how they handle teacher mental health and student safety. Rebecca wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Will it be enough? To protect other children? To stop someone else from becoming what I became? It's a start, Sarah said. Change happens slowly, but it happens. You're proof of that. As evening fell, Rebecca sat at her desk in her room at Hillside, beginning her letter to Charlie. The words came slowly at first, then faster as she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her loss without trying to fill the void with substitutes. My dearest Charlie, she wrote, I've been looking for you in all the wrong places, trying to recreate you instead of remembering you. Today I choose to let you rest, to love you as you were, not as I wished you still could be. Outside, her window, the autumn wind stirred the leaves in the garden. Somewhere in the city, Tommy Mitchell was safe with his family, healing from the trauma she'd caused. And here, in this quiet room, Rebecca Foster was finally learning to let her son go, one memory at a time. Detective Sarah Martinez stood before the Riverside School Board, her voice steady as she presented the findings of their investigation. The meeting room was packed with concerned parents, teachers, and administrators, all wrestling with the implications of Rebecca Foster's case. The warning signs were there, Sarah said, gesturing to the timeline projected on the screen behind her. Multiple schools, multiple incidents, multiple chances to intervene. Each time the response was the same: transfer and hope the problem goes away. Principal Patricia Wilson sat in the front row, her normally pristine appearance showing signs of strain. The past month had taken its toll on everyone involved in Tommy Mitchell's case, but perhaps especially on those who felt they should have seen it coming. We've identified several key failures in the system, Sarah continued, clicking through her presentation. Lack of communication between districts, insufficient mental health support for staff, no standardized protocol for reporting concerning behavior, but most critically, a culture of silence that prioritized reputation over student safety. In the back of the room, Officer Michael Anderson leaned against the wall, watching the faces of the board members. Some showed genuine concern, others defensive skepticism. Change wouldn't come easily, but it would come. Grace Sullivan from CPS stepped forward, adding her perspective to the presentation. We've interviewed dozens of former students and parents. While Tommy's case was the most severe, it wasn't isolated. Rebecca Foster's fixation on certain children created an atmosphere of discomfort and fear that went unreported for years. A board member raised his hand, his expression troubled. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah clicked to the next slide, revealing a comprehensive reform plan. Mandatory mental health screenings for all staff, not just during hiring but annually. Clear reporting channels for concerning behavior, better communication between districts and agencies, and most importantly, a shift in culture that encourages speaking up rather than staying quiet. The room erupted in discussion, voices rising as parents demanded answers and administrators defended past decisions. Through it all, Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, though her hands clenched tightly around her presentation remote. During a break in the meeting, Mike approached her with coffee. "You're doing good work here," he said quietly. "It's not easy making people face their blind spots." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. "I keep thinking about Tommy. How many adults he encountered who might have noticed something was wrong? How many chances we had to stop this before it reached that point?" Frank Cooper, the market owner who had provided crucial security footage during the investigation, stood up to speak. His testimony about Rebecca's visits to his store with Tommy painted a clear picture of grooming behavior that should have raised red flags. She'd come in 2, 3 times a week, he explained, always with the boy, always controlling where he went, what he looked at. I knew something felt off, but I didn't know who to tell, didn't want to cause trouble if I was wrong. His words resonated through the room. How many others had noticed but stayed silent? How many had chosen the comfort of inaction over the responsibility of speaking up? Dr. Emily Ross, Tommy's therapist, provided expert testimony about the psychological impact of such situations on children. They often show us through behavior what they can't tell us in words, she explained. Changes in personality, withdrawal from activities they once enjoyed, anxiety about certain adults or situations. These are all signals we need to learn to recognize. The meeting stretched into evening, each new speaker adding another layer to the complex picture of systemic failure that had allowed Rebecca Foster's obsession to escalate unchecked. Finally, the board voted unanimously to adopt the proposed reforms. Outside, as people filed out into the cool night air, Sarah found herself standing with Patricia Wilson. The principal looked exhausted but determined. "We're implementing new training at Maple Grove," Patricia said, "teaching staff to recognize warning signs, creating safe channels for reporting concerns. It's not enough, but it's a start." Sarah nodded encouragingly. "Sometimes that's all we need, a start. The rest follows if we stay committed." Back at the precinct, Sarah and Mike reviewed the day's events in their shared office space. The wall behind Sarah's desk was covered in photos and documents from the case, each piece telling part of the story that had led them here. "You know, what strikes me," Mike said, studying the timeline, "how many people touch this case without realizing they were all seeing pieces of the same puzzle? The school administrators, the market owner, the parents who complained. If they'd had a way to connect those dots." Sarah picked up a photo of Tommy taken the day after his rescue. Despite everything he'd been through, there was resilience in his smile. "That's why these reforms matter. Next time, maybe we'll see the pattern before it becomes a crisis." Grace Sullivan arrived with dinner. They'd all been working late hours since the investigation began. As they ate, they discussed the next steps, implementing new protocols, training staff, building better communication channels between agencies. "The hardest part will be changing the culture," Grace mused. "Getting people to understand that speaking up isn't about causing trouble, it's about preventing harm." Sarah thought about Rebecca Foster still receiving treatment at Hillside. Her latest evaluation showed progress, but also highlighted how early intervention might have prevented her descent into delusion. "We need to make it clear that mental health support isn't punishment," Sarah said. Rebecca's colleagues noticed changes in her behavior after Charlie's death, but no one wanted to risk her job by suggesting she needed help. Mike's phone buzzed, a text from Jennifer Mitchell. Tommy had scored the lead role in the school play, another small step in his journey back to normalcy. These moments of triumph reminded them why their work mattered. As night fell over Riverside, Sarah gathered her files, preparing for tomorrow's presentation to another school district. Change would come slowly, but it would come. Each new policy, each training session, each open channel of communication was another thread in the safety net they were weaving. Before leaving, she paused at the evidence board, looking at the photos that told the story of failure and redemption. Tommy's whispered plea for help had exposed not just one woman's tragedy, but a system in need of reform. Tomorrow, they would continue the work of making sure that when children whispered, adults would listen. That when teachers struggled, help would be available. That when warning signs appeared, action would follow. The lights of the precinct dimmed as Sarah walked to her car, carrying the weight of responsibility and the hope of change. Sometimes the biggest transformations started with the smallest voices. They just needed to learn how to hear them. Grace Sullivan paced through the new Child Safety Center at Riverside Police Department, arranging resource pamphlets and adjusting the colorful posters that adorned the walls. The facility had been created in direct response to Tommy Mitchell's case, a safe space where children could speak with trained professionals without fear. The interview room looked nothing like the stark interrogation spaces elsewhere in the building. Comfortable chairs, soft lighting, and art supplies created an atmosphere where young voices could feel heard. A two-way mirror allowed parents and investigators to observe without intimidating the children. "What do you think?" Grace asked as Dr. Emily Ross examined the play therapy corner. "Will it help them feel safe enough to open up?" Emily picked up one of the therapeutic puppets, testing its movements. "It's perfect. The environment makes such a difference when we're asking children to share difficult experiences." The center would officially open tomorrow, but today they were conducting a final walkthrough. Detective Sarah Martinez had arranged for Tommy Mitchell to visit to give his perspective on what might help other children feel secure. The door chimed softly as Jennifer Mitchell arrived with Tommy. The boy moved through the space with curious confidence, his junior police badge pinned to his jacket. "Cool!" he exclaimed, spotting the art station. "It's like Dr. Emily's office, but bigger." Grace smiled, watching Tommy explore. His recovery had become a blueprint for their approach, understanding how children process trauma and what helps them heal. The center incorporated many elements that had proven helpful in his therapy. Sarah arrived carrying a box of new training materials. The program she'd developed would teach officers and social workers how to recognize signs of grooming behavior and psychological manipulation. Tommy's case had shown them how subtle the warning signs could be. "The interview guides are ready," Sarah announced, setting down the box. "We've included specific protocols for different age groups and situations. No more one-size-fits-all approaches." Tommy wandered over, peering into the box with interest. "Are these to help other kids like me?" Sarah knelt to his level. "Exactly. You helped us understand what kids need when they're scared or confused. Now we can help them better because of what you taught us." Jennifer watched her son with pride, tinged with lingering sadness. The past months had changed him. He was more serious in some ways, but also more compassionate. He'd started a peer support group at school for kids dealing with difficult situations. Officer Michael Anderson arrived as they were setting up the recording equipment that would document interviews while being less intrusive than traditional cameras. He carried a stack of child-friendly police badges like the one he'd given Tommy. "These are for the kids who come through here," he explained. "Sometimes having something tangible, something that represents safety and courage, can make all the difference." Tommy touched his own badge reflexively. "Like mine, help me be brave." "Just like that, buddy." The afternoon continued with final preparations. Emily tested the recording system while Grace arranged comfort items, blankets, stuffed animals, stress balls. Each element had been carefully chosen to create an environment where truth could emerge gently. Frank Cooper stopped by, bringing drinks and snacks for everyone. The market owner had become an unexpected ally in their mission, offering his store as a safe haven where children could ask for help if they felt threatened. "Got the new posters up in the shop," he reported, "right where kids can see them. Numbers for the helpline, instructions on what to do if they're scared. Simple stuff, but visible." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Sometimes that's all it takes. Letting them know help is available, that there are adults who will listen." Principal Wilson arrived later, carrying a folder of new school safety protocols. The comprehensive guidelines covered everything from staff background checks to student support systems. Tommy's case had exposed gaps in their security that no one had previously considered. "We're implementing these across the district," Patricia explained. "Every school, every grade level. No more isolated incidents falling through the cracks." The group gathered in the main room, surrounded by the tools and systems they'd created from lessons learned through pain and perseverance. Tommy sat between his mother and Officer Mike, drawing a picture of what safety meant to him. "What are you drawing there?" Grace asked, noting how his artwork had evolved during his recovery. Tommy held up the paper, revealing a complex scene of people helping each other. "It's like a chain," he explained. "When one person helps someone, they learn to help others too." His simple wisdom struck them all. This center, these protocols, all their careful planning. It was about more than just preventing harm. It was about teaching children that their voices mattered, that help was available, that courage could be contagious. Dr. Marcus Chen arrived from Hillside, bringing insights from his work with Rebecca Foster. Her case had highlighted the importance of early intervention, not just for potential victims, but for those at risk of causing harm. "Rebecca's therapy is progressing," he reported quietly to Sarah. "She's working on understanding how her grief transformed into obsession. It's valuable information for identifying similar patterns in others." The sun began to set outside the center's windows as they finished the final preparations. Tomorrow, these rooms would begin their real purpose, providing sanctuary and support for children who needed to be heard. Tommy stood at the art station one last time, adding finishing touches to his drawing. The chain of helping hands he'd created stretched across the paper, each figure reaching back to lift someone else up. Jennifer wrapped an arm around her son's shoulders, studying his work. "You've helped create something really special here, Tommy." The boy looked around the room at the adults who had turned his whispered plea for help into a mission of prevention and protection. "We all did," he said softly, "together." Grace gathered her files, ready to head home and prepare for tomorrow's opening. The center represented everything they'd learned about protecting children, the importance of safe spaces, trained listeners, and clear pathways to help. As they left, Tommy placed his drawing on the wall, a child's vision of what was possible when people chose to listen and act. The chain of helping hands would be the first thing future visitors would see, a reminder that they weren't alone. Mike locked up, setting the security system that would guard this new sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but they were ready to listen, to help, to turn whispers into action. The lights dimmed in the Child Safety Center as night fell over Riverside, but the promise it represented glowed bright. A promise to every child that their voice would be heard, their safety protected, their courage honored. Winter arrived, early in Riverside, dusting Maple Grove Elementary with the first snow of the season. Inside the school auditorium, parents and teachers gathered for an unusual assembly. 6 months had passed since Tommy Mitchell's whispered plea for help changed their community forever. Detective Sarah Martinez stood at the podium, surveying the crowd. The faces before her held a new awareness, a shared understanding born from difficult lessons. Tonight they would launch a program that grew from those lessons, Project Safe Voice. "A child's whisper can shake mountains," Sarah began, her voice carrying through the hushed room. "But only if we're listening." Behind her, a screen displayed statistics about child safety and intervention programs. Real numbers that represented real children, each one as important as Tommy had been. In the front row, Tommy sat between his parents, no longer the frightened boy from that autumn morning. He wore a small suit for the occasion, his junior police badge polished to a shine. Beside him, Officer Michael Anderson adjusted his own uniform, ready to present the community outreach portion of the program. Principal Patricia Wilson took the stage next, her usual confidence tempered by humility. 6 months ago, we failed one of our students. We missed the signs, ignored the warnings, chose comfortable silence over necessary action. Today, we changed that pattern. The lights dimmed as she introduced a training video produced with input from child psychologists, law enforcement, and survivors. On screen, actors recreated subtle warning signs: a teacher's excessive attention, a child's withdrawal, the small shifts in behavior that could signal bigger problems. Dr. Emily Ross provided professional commentary throughout the presentation, explaining the psychology behind both predatory behavior and children's responses to trauma. Her words carried extra weight now, backed by her successful work with Tommy and other affected children. Frank Cooper watched from the back of the room, remembering how his own uncertainty had almost kept him from reporting Rebecca Foster's suspicious behavior. The training addressed that directly, teaching people to trust their instincts, providing clear channels for reporting concerns. Grace Sullivan stood up to explain the new reporting system. "We've removed the barriers between agencies," she said, displaying a simple flowchart. "No more information falling through cracks. No more assuming someone else will handle it. Every report gets logged, tracked, and investigated." The audience absorbed the information with solemn attention. Many had known Rebecca Foster, had seen her with Tommy and other students. The guilt of inaction weighed heavy, but tonight was about moving forward, about doing better. Jennifer Mitchell stepped up to share her family's perspective. Her voice trembled slightly but grew stronger. As she spoke, "We could have lost our son because everyone thought someone else would speak up, because everyone waited for absolute proof before acting. That ends now." David Mitchell squeezed Tommy's shoulder as his wife spoke. The boy had grown taller in the past months, carrying himself with quiet confidence. His story had become a catalyst for change, but he was more than just a cautionary tale. He was a survivor who helped shape the very programs designed to protect others. Sarah returned to the podium to introduce the practical elements of Project Safe Voice: new security protocols, anonymous reporting systems, regular training sessions for staff and volunteers, but more importantly, a fundamental shift in how they approached child safety. "We're creating a community where speaking up is the norm," she explained, "where children know they'll be believed, where adults understand their responsibility to act, where silence is no longer an option." Officer Mike shared stories from his years of service, carefully anonymized but powerful in their impact. He described the subtle signs he'd learned to recognize, the importance of trusting instincts, the difference that one attentive adult could make in a child's life. The presentation shifted to prevention strategies. Dr. Marcus Chen, joining virtually from Hillside, discussed the importance of mental health support for school staff. Rebecca Foster's decline didn't happen overnight, he reminded them. Early intervention might have prevented her breakdown and protected her students. Tommy raised his hand during the question period, surprising everyone. His voice was clear and steady as he asked, "What happens to kids who don't have someone to tell?" Sarah smiled gently. "That's why we're all here, Tommy. To make sure every child has someone to tell and that those people know how to listen and act." The assembly concluded with a commitment ceremony. Parents, teachers, and community members stood together, pledging to be active participants in protecting their children. Each received a small pin, a silver whistle symbolizing their role as listeners and protectors. As people filed out into the snowy evening, Sarah noticed Tommy lingering by the display of educational materials. He picked up a brochure about peer support programs, studying it intently. "Thinking of starting something at school?" she asked, joining him. Tommy nodded. "Some kids might feel better talking to other kids first. I want to help them know it's okay to speak up." Jennifer, overheard and wrapped her arm around her son. "You already have, sweetheart, more than you know." Outside, Mike watched families heading to their cars, noting how parents held their children closer, how teachers spoke more carefully with students, how awareness had become action in their small community. Grace approached him, clutching her. "Folders. The first training session for the new reporting system starts tomorrow. 20 other districts have already asked to implement it." Mike nodded, remembering that autumn morning when a child's whisper had set everything in motion. Small voices, big changes. The snow continued to fall softly over Maple Grove Elementary, covering the ground in clean, white possibility. Inside, the last few attendees gathered their materials, carrying with them new knowledge and renewed purpose. Tomorrow, they would begin the real work of turning tonight's promises into daily practice. But for now, they stood together in the quiet aftermath of transformation, knowing that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest voices. Tommy's junior police badge caught the light as he left with his parents, a reminder that courage comes in many forms and that safety grows stronger when built by many hands working together. Spring blossoms adorned the courtyard of Hillside Mental Health Center as Dr. Marcus Chen reviewed the final evaluation papers on his desk. After 8 months of intensive therapy, Rebecca Foster had reached a crucial milestone in her recovery. The question now wasn't just about her mental health. It was about accountability, redemption, and the possibility of rebuilding a life marked by tragedy. Robert Foster sat across from him, his expression thoughtful as he studied his ex-wife's latest progress reports. The weekly family therapy sessions had helped them both process their shared grief over Charlie's death, though the path forward remained complex. "She's asking about community service," Dr. Chen explained, adjusting his glasses, "specifically working with grief support groups for parents who've lost children. It's a significant step, acknowledging her experience while channeling it constructively." Robert nodded slowly. "And you think she's ready?" "With proper supervision and continued therapy, yes. She understands now that her actions toward Tommy stemmed from unprocessed trauma. More importantly, she's developed healthy coping mechanisms. Through the window, they could see Rebecca in the garden, tending to the spring flowers. Her movements were calmer now, deliberate rather than frantic. The desperate energy that had driven her to seek replacement children had transformed into something quieter, more grounded. Sarah Martinez arrived for her monthly check-in, carrying updates about Project Safe Voice. The program, born from Tommy's case, had already prevented several similar situations across the state. Rebecca's story had become a powerful teaching tool for recognizing signs of psychological distress in educators. "The school board wants to know if Rebecca would be willing to record an educational video," Sarah said. "Not about Tommy specifically, but about her descent into obsession, the warning signs others missed." Dr. Chen made a note in his file. "I'll discuss it with her. She's been working on taking responsibility for her actions without drowning in guilt. This might be a constructive way to do that." Grace Sullivan joined them, bringing the latest statistics from the Child Safety Center. The facility had helped dozens of children since its opening, each case reinforcing the importance of early intervention and clear reporting channels. "We had a teacher self-report last week," Grace shared. "She recognized in herself some of the same attachment patterns Rebecca displayed, asked for help before it escalated. That's real progress." Rebecca's therapy session was scheduled for the afternoon. She entered Dr. Chen's office, wearing the simple clothes provided by the facility, but her posture spoke of growing self-awareness rather than defeat. "I've been thinking about Tommy's parents," she began, settling into her usual chair. "About what I put them through, the fear, the uncertainty." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "I want to make amends, but I know I can't erase what I did." Dr. Chen leaned forward. "What does making amends look like to you?" "Using my experience to prevent others from making the same mistakes, helping people recognize when grief turns toxic." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I've written another letter, not asking forgiveness, just acknowledging the pain I caused." The letter would join others in a file available to the Mitchells, if and when they chose to read them. For now, the act of writing itself was part of Rebecca's healing process. Robert stayed for the afternoon session, their shared memories of Charlie now tempered by understanding rather than denial. They discussed the upcoming anniversary of their son's death, planning healthy ways to honor his memory without slipping into obsession. "I'm going to visit his grave," Rebecca said softly. "For the first time since everything happened, I think I'm ready to see him as he was, not as I tried to make others be." Sarah watched the session through the observation window, remembering the frantic woman they'd confronted at the cabin. The transformation wasn't magical or complete, but it was real, proof that intervention could break cycles of trauma. Later, Rebecca met with her art therapist, working on a series of paintings that tracked her journey from loss through obsession to recovery. The images showed her growing ability to separate reality from delusion, to recognize Charlie as a cherished memory rather than a ghost to chase. "I used to see him everywhere," she explained, adding subtle colors to her latest piece, "in every child who smiled like him or laughed like him. Now I understand those were echoes of my grief, not signs or messages." Dr. Chen updated her file. "Patient continues to show marked improvement in reality testing and emotional regulation, demonstrates genuine remorse and insight into previous actions. Recommend gradual transition to supervised community involvement." The spring breeze carried the scent of new growth through the open window as Rebecca worked on her contribution to the education program. Her words would help others understand the subtle line between caring and obsession, between grief and delusion. Grace reviewed the draft of Rebecca's testimony, noting how it aligned with their training materials. "Your honesty about the warning signs, about how you rationalized your behavior, it could help others recognize these patterns early." Rebecca nodded, her hands steady as she made revisions. "If someone had really seen me back then, really understood what was happening, maybe Tommy wouldn't have had to be so brave." The day wound down with a group therapy session where Rebecca shared her plans for the future. No more teaching, no more seeking replacement children. Instead, she would work with adults who understood the crushing weight of loss, helping them find healthy ways to carry their grief. Dr. Chen watched his patient leave for the evening, noting how she paused to water the plants she'd helped nurture in the garden. Recovery wasn't a straight line, but Rebecca Foster had found her way back from the depths of delusion to a place where healing seemed possible. The setting sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as the staff prepared for shift change. His final notes for the day, Dr. Chen wrote, "Recovery is not about erasing the past, but about building a future that acknowledges both harm and hope." Rebecca Foster's journey from tragedy through obsession to accountability serves as both warning and promise that with proper support, even the deepest wounds can begin to heal. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning at Maple Grove Elementary. Officer Michael Anderson parked his patrol car in the same spot where he'd first noticed Tommy Mitchell's silent plea for help. The school grounds bloomed with spring flowers, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled this space 12 months ago. Inside the newly established Child Safety Center, a celebration was underway. Project Safe Voice had reached its first-year milestone, marking hundreds of successful interventions and countless children protected through early warning detection. The walls, once bare, now displayed artwork from children who had found their voices their courage reflected in bright colors and bold strokes. Tommy Mitchell stood before the gathered crowd, taller now and more confident. His junior police badge caught the light as he spoke about his experiences helping other children. "Learn to speak up. Being scared is okay," he told them, "but being scared alone isn't. That's why we're all here." Detective Sarah Martinez presented the year's statistics: 57 potential incidents prevented, 32 educators receiving early intervention, support, and 15 schools adopting their comprehensive safety protocols. But beyond the numbers were the stories, the quiet victories of children who knew they would be heard. Dr. Emily Ross shared updates about Tommy's peer support program, which had spread to neighboring schools. "Children helping children," she explained. "Sometimes the strongest voices come from those who understand the fear firsthand." At Hillside Mental Health Center, Rebecca Foster had begun working with parent grief support groups under careful supervision. Her story, though difficult, served as both warning and catalyst for change. Dr. Marcus Chen monitored her progress, noting how she channeled her experience into helping others avoid similar paths. Frank Cooper had transformed his market into a safe haven, training his staff to recognize signs of distress in young customers. The Safe Place sign in his window had already helped 3 children find their way to safety. Principal Patricia Wilson implemented new security measures at Maple Grove, but more importantly, she fostered an environment where students felt empowered to speak up. The whisper that had started with Tommy had grown into a chorus of young voices unafraid to ask for help. Jennifer and David Mitchell watched their son thrive, his trauma transformed into purpose. Tommy's Batman backpack still hung in his room, but now it shared space with awards for peer counseling and community service. As the celebration continued, Mike stepped outside for a moment of reflection. The weight of his badge felt different now, not just a symbol of authority, but a reminder of responsibility. One child's whispered plea had rippled outward, touching countless lives and changing an entire community's approach to protecting its most vulnerable members. The afternoon, sun painted long shadows across the playground where children played freely, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. In this moment, Mike understood that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest voices. We just have to be brave enough to listen. Up next, more incredible stories await. Click to discover tales that will move and inspire you, reminding us all that courage comes in many forms, and that hope can be found in the most unexpected places.